You'll recall that during the first stage of Hosea's ministry, Uzziah, the king of Judah, was faithful to God. So, while God pronounced judgments on the northern kingdom of Israel at this time, he responded quite differently to the southern kingdom. In chapter 1, verse 7, he said, "I will have mercy on the house of Judah." But as we're about to see, Hosea's prophecies in this first division had much more than this to say about Judah. Listen to the second part of Hosea's revelations from the first division. Hosea taught Judah's leaders that Israel will receive God's blessings in the latter days through reunification with Judah and submission to David's house. To understand why Hosea focused his revelations on God's blessings coming through Judah, we need to review 3 Old Testament themes that shaped Hosea's prophecies. In the first place, from as early as the patriarchal period, the Old Testament stressed the importance of the unity of the 12 tribes of Israel. The book of Genesis indicates this ideal, particularly in the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. And the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel also promote the unity of all Israel. Of course, Hosea began his ministry when the tribes of Israel and Judah were divided and at odds with each other. But in line with these earlier biblical ideals, Hosea stressed that God's future blessings for Israel would require reunification of the 12 tribes. In the second place, Hosea also drew from the Old Testament theme of submission to David's house. Several earlier biblical books, especially Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as well as a number of early Psalms, confirm that David's house, the royal line of Judah, was to be the permanent dynasty over all of God's people. Like the first theme, this theme is rooted in the story of Joseph and his brothers. In Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, the patriarch Jacob prophesied over his sons and predicted that the scepter, a symbol of royal authority, shall not depart from Judah. So, at a time when the northern tribes rejected the authority of David's throne, Hosea stressed that Israel's future blessings would require their renewed submission to the rule of David's house. In the third place, to grasp Hosea's hopeful words about blessings through Judah, it's also important to keep in mind God's ultimate goal for all of history. As many Old Testament historical books and the Psalms indicate, the reason God's people were to be unified under David's house was ultimately to spread God's kingdom to the ends of the earth. As before, we can see this theme as early as the story of Joseph and his brothers. When Jacob prophesied over his son Judah in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, he not only said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," he also said, "To him shall be the obedience of the peoples," or nations, as it may be translated. In the end, the 12 tribes of Israel, united under the rule of Judah's king, will spread God's reign to the whole world. And Hosea's earliest prophecies about Judah promoted this glorious vision of the future.